Thank you for thank you for the invitation to speak here today. As Emily said, I'm Mhairi Aitken. I'm an ethics fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. The Alan Turing Institute is the UK's National Institute for AI and Data Science. And so in my role as an ethics fellow, I work in the public policy programme at the Alan Turing Institute. In public policy programme, our work mostly focuses on uses of AI and data science in the public sector or by government bodies. So we conduct research and provide advice to public sector bodies and government departments around ethical and responsible uses of AI and data-intensive innovation. And I'm really delighted to be invited to talk to you today. And my talk's going to cover a social license for AI and engagement with children, and particularly how those two things are linked, how engagement with children can help us to inform or to establish and pursue a social license for AI. So in my talk today, I'm going to cover a few things. First of all, I'm going to give a very, very brief kind of introduction to ethics and AI, or what ethics means to me in the work that I do in relation to AI, how I approach and pursue ethics in relation to AI. And then going to introduce the concept of a social license and why this is really important, why it's important to pursue or establish a social license for AI and data-intensive practices. And then I'm going to focus on one particular example, an area of work that I lead at the Alan Turing Institute around children's rights and children's engagement to inform ethical and responsible data-intensive practices and engaging children with the topics of AI. And so I'm going to give some examples of the work that we've done in a collaboration with the Scottish AI Alliance and Children's Parliament to engage children in discussions around the design, development, deployment and governance of AI systems and how that's feeding into approaches around establishing a social license for AI. So first things first, what does ethics mean in relation to AI? As I said, I'm an ethics fellow, so my background's in sociology, and all my work is really focused around kind of ethical and social considerations around AI and data-intensive innovation. The first thing that I think is really important to emphasize when we're thinking about ethics and AI is that ethics is not the same as legal compliance. Laws, regulations set out what we must and must not do in terms of collecting, processing data, or in terms of automated decisions or algorithmic decision-making. But ethics is not just about legal compliance, and ethics often involves going quite far beyond legal compliance. So while laws and regulations set out what we must and must not do, and technical expertise can set out what we could or could not do, ethics is really about grappling with the tricky questions of what we should and should not do in terms of data practices and in terms of AI innovation, design, development, deployment of AI systems. And these questions of what we should and should not do are really tricky questions. They're not questions that ever have straightforward answers. They're questions that will have different answers from different people. And they're also questions that will have different answers in different contexts or in relation to different uses of technologies or different innovation practices. So what's really clear is that grappling with these ethical questions of what we should or should not do requires continual negotiation and continual judgment. They're not questions that we can have one-off answers to. And they're also questions that require us to engage with diverse stakeholders, diverse communities to understand the different views and different perspectives that need to be taken account of when we think about what we should or should not do around AI. The other thing that I really want to emphasize is that ethics is not just about avoiding negative impacts or avoiding risks relating to AI and data-intensive innovation. I think it's often conceptualized like that. There's often discussions of ethics in relation to AI and data practices where it's seen as being about managing or avoiding risk, or as something that you have to do to avoid potential harms. And of course, it is partly that, but it's also really importantly about maximizing the value of innovation, maximizing the value and benefits of technology, and ensuring that those benefits are equitably distributed across society. And that's a really important part of the work that we do in the ethics team at the Alan Turing Institute. And a big emphasis in our work is on understanding how different communities, different impacted communities, different stakeholder groups might be impacted differently by the ways that AI systems are designed, developed and deployed, or by broader data-intensive practices, data-intensive innovation. And so a big part of our work is developing mechanisms to engage with impacted communities or potentially impacted communities to ensure that their voices, their experiences are reflected in governance processes, in policy processes, in regulatory discussions, and also within development processes around AI systems. And that really brings me on to the next focus of this talk, which is the concept of a social license. This is something that really fascinates me. It's something that is a focus of the research that I do, seeking to understand what it would mean to establish a social license for AI and data-intensive innovation, and what are the kinds of approaches that we need to develop to pursue and maintain a social license for data-intensive innovation and AI. So taking a bit of a step back to set out kind of what a social license is. A social license, or the concept of social license, has its origins really in extractive industries. So industries like oil, mining, forestry, extractive industries, which in the 1990s, when there was growing concern around environmental and social impacts of extractive industries, the concept of a social license emerged through a recognition of the importance of industries and organizations of engaging with impacted communities to ensure that they were meaningfully addressing the concerns of those communities, to ensure the sustainability and social acceptability of those enterprises. Now, of course, experiences in extractive industries are far from perfect, and there are many examples of approaches which were ostensibly about establishing a social license for those practices, which were in fact quite tokenistic, which didn't necessarily meaningfully address concerns, but were more engaging with communities to ensure support for existing operations. And that's, of course, not what I mean when I'm talking about establishing a social license for AI and data-intensive innovation. But the idea of a social license is really interesting when we think about how this might apply to data-intensive practices or to the design, development, deployment of AI systems. Essentially, a social license is a tacit agreement between an organization or an industry and its stakeholders. So it's unwritten. It's not something which is that exists in a physical form. It's not a written agreement or a written license, but it's a reflection of the extent to which practices align with societal values and expectations. And it's established by relationships of trust between an organization or between an industry and impacted communities or impacted stakeholders. It's about aligning with societal values and expectations and meaningfully addressing public interests, societal interests, as well as concerns, and reflecting those in the practices and operations of an industry or an organization. Now, when we compare what it might mean to pursue a social license for AI and data-intensive technologies with kind of early experiences of pursuing a social license in extractive industries, there are some useful comparisons, and there are some very clear distinctions to be made between what those approaches might be. For example, in extractive industries, pursuing a social license was mostly pursued through engagement with local communities in the vicinity of operations. So communities living nearby mines or forestry operations or places where those extractive industries were operating. Now, of course, when we think about who would be the impacted communities in relation to data-intensive innovation or AI, it's a much less clearly defined set of communities or impacted stakeholder groups. It's much less useful to think just about physical proximity or vicinity or local communities. Of course, when we're talking about AI systems, the people who may be impacted might be very geographically dispersed and much more diverse. And it's also much less clear to think about who the impacted communities might be. Communities who might be direct service users of a system where an algorithmic system is implemented or where decisions are made through a data-intensive system. But there are also people who might be impacted indirectly by allocation of resources or by the ways that decisions affect society or affect communities. And so when we begin to think about who are the relevant stakeholders that we engage to establish a social license, it quickly becomes very broad and very diverse. Often approaches to defining or identifying stakeholders suggest that stakeholders are either people who are impacted by the operations or practices of an industry or organization, or people who can have an influence on those impact or are important to shaping the success of those operations or practices. And that again leads us to a very broad view of who those stakeholders might be. In part, in thinking about who is important for enabling those practices to proceed, we can also include the people from whom data is derived. And in many of the projects that we are looking at or thinking about data-intensive systems or development of AI systems, the people from whom data is derived are absolutely crucial to the success of those operations. And that if we don't have a social license for collecting and processing that data, we're potentially leading to a lack of social acceptability, potentially opposition, potentially concern around how those practices are enabled. And so we need to think really broadly about who we might engage with, who might be impacted, and who are the stakeholders around data-intensive projects. And so establishing a social license really entails engaging with this broad range of stakeholders, engaging with diverse communities to understand what their needs are, what their interests are, what their expectations are, and to align with those and to meaningfully reflect and address interests and concerns in the design, development, deployment, and governance of AI or data-intensive innovation projects. So to set out a bit more about what that looks like or what that might entail, I want to discuss one particular programme of work that I lead at the Alan Turing Institute, which is around engaging children and looking at children's rights in relation to AI and data-intensive innovation. So this work is a collaboration with the Scottish AI Alliance and Children's Parliament, where we're looking at how AI impacts children's lives, how it might impact children's rights, and how children can be involved in shaping the future of AI design, development, deployment, and governance that impacts their lives. So just to take a step back and think about why it's important to explore children's rights in relation to AI. Children are likely to be the group who will be most impacted by AI over the course of their lives, both positively and negatively, but they're also the group that are least represented in decision-making processes or policy-making processes around AI. So children from the earliest ages are engaging with AI, sometimes intentionally, sometimes consciously, for example, through smart toys which contain AI within them. But sometimes it's less, it's not necessarily a particular choice to engage with AI, but those AI systems are impacting children's lives. So from the earliest ages, children interact with smart toys and smart devices. Children have devices in their homes, such as smart speakers that they're interacting with. Increasingly, children are engaging with AI to access information about the world online, and indeed, most recently through use of generative AI systems, which are becoming an increasing presence within children's lives. They're also using AI within education settings, where there are interactive tools or personalized learning experiences which use AI to personalize and tailor delivery of education. They're increasingly using or interacting with AI on social media, which has playing a significant role in shaping their friendships, their relationships, as well as access to information about the world. And then there are also forms of AI which are making important decisions or informing important decisions about children's lives, which children aren't necessarily aware of and are not often asked for their views or asked for their views on the ways that these systems are used. So AI systems that are informing decisions about access to services in education, in housing, in healthcare, decisions about children's lives or about their families and their communities. And children are very often not involved in decision-making around the design or deployment of these systems, even though these systems have significant impacts on their lives. And so in our work at the Alan Turing Institute, we have a program of work around child-centered AI, looking at children's rights and AI. As I say, this is partly involves a collaboration with Scottish AI Alliance and Children's Parliament, who are directly engaging with children. But we also have other collaborations, for example, currently with the Council of Europe, we're conducting a survey of Council of Europe member states looking at existing legal frameworks relating to children's rights and AI. And we previously worked with UNICEF, piloting UNICEF's child-centered AI principles. And so we're looking broadly at what children's rights, what AI means in relation to children's rights, and how we can develop child-centered approaches to address children's rights in relation to AI systems. So in our collaboration with Scottish AI Alliance and Children's Parliament, we've working with 4 primary schools across Scotland to engage children with topics around AI. So since September 2022, so September of last year, we've been working with Children's Parliament Scottish AI Alliance with these 4 primary schools across Scotland in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Shetland, and Stirling. So quite widely spread out across Scotland, including major cities, as well as remote island communities and a small town kind of rural community in the centre of Scotland. And we've been engaging with children between the ages of 7 and 11. And this is really important because there's been a fair amount of research which has looked at teenagers or adolescents' experiences around AI, particularly in digital environments, particularly looking at issues around online safety or around social media. But there's really been very little work that's explored younger age groups. And as I've already said, children are engaging with AI from really the youngest ages. And it's important that we seek to understand what children's experiences of AI are and how they might be involved in shaping those processes. So we work with 87 children across 4 schools, and we began with in-person full-day workshops in each of the schools to introduce AI. What's really important about these first workshops was that we didn't go in with I guess it wasn't a typical kind of STEM approach focusing on science and technology. These workshops began with a morning session which was focused on children's rights and talking to children about the UNCRC, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, exploring children's rights. And then from there, we introduced AI. And so AI was very much contextualized in thinking about how it might impact children's rights or what the children's rights implications of AI might be. And in this workshop, we introduced the broad concepts of what AI is, how AI is designed and developed, how it works. And we used very kind of tactile activities using lots of arts and crafts, lots of Play-Doh, lots of plasticine, lots of paint, lots of mess, and really no screens. This was all about hands-on physical stuff to think about how an AI system might be designed and developed and to understand how these systems work and how they impact their lives. Now, after our initial in-person workshops with these schools, we then, from each of the schools, selected 3 or 4 investigators, individual children from each of the classes who became our investigator team. And the investigator team then met and continue to meet each month for online workshops. In choosing the investigators, we chose children who were enthusiastic to be involved, who were keen to learn more, who wanted to learn more. But we also chose children who, through discussions with the school and discussions with Children's Parliament, who we identified as being ones who might benefit the most from taking part in this process. So it's not necessarily the children who were most articulate or most experienced at engaging in these kinds of activities, but the ones who might benefit most from taking part. And these investigators met each month to go into more depth and discuss aspects of AI. But between these monthly meetings, the whole classes continued to engage, and they undertook missions to investigate AI and how AI impacts their lives. Some of these missions involved kind of going out into their communities and looking at where AI might be used. And some of them involved kind of hands-on activities to understand more how AI systems work. And that included, one of the missions was that they had to imagine that they were an AI system, and they had to design how an AI system could make predictions about planning new playground facilities for children. And so they had to think about data that they would collect, how they would process that data, and how decisions might be made as a result of that. And it worked really well to get them to understand those processes and decision making, but also the limitations of an AI system, because they couldn't rely on intuition or knowledge that they had or contextual information that they had, which wasn't contained in the data that they collected. So now we're into the second phase of this project. And the first phase was really focused on developing children's understandings of AI and exploring how they want to be involved in the future. But the second phase, the children are now engaging more directly with developers, with policymakers, and seeking to inform decision-making processes around AI systems that potentially impact their lives, and looking at particular sectors in which AI is used. So briefly, these were our key research questions at the outset of the project. Firstly, what children currently know about AI, what they want to know about AI and how it is used, and what questions they have around that. What children's current opinions or perceptions of AI are, and then how do these adapt, strengthen, or change as they learn more about the subject. And really importantly, how would children like AI to be used in the future? And what do children think are the limits to how AI should be used in the future? And then we're also exploring whether children feel like they currently have a voice or a say in how AI is being used, and how they might want to be involved in decision-making about future uses of AI. And so these were our research questions at the beginning, which we are continuing to explore. Although the research has really been shaped by children's interests and the areas that they want to focus on, and the areas of interest to the children. These are key themes that have come out through the work. These have really been shaped by children's interests. So as I said, we started with our research questions, but what was really important is that the children themselves could shape the direction of this research and could shape what we focused on. And so it was very much led by the children. But these are key themes that came out through the first phase of the work as areas of particular interest to the children. Firstly, AI in education, which is perhaps not a big surprise that we were engaging with these children in primary schools. And they were really interested about the ways that AI is used in educational settings and the implications that it might have. They're particularly interested in new immersive or interactive experiences, but they were also really concerned about how decisions might be made about them based on algorithmic systems or based on AI that don't necessarily take full account of their individual circumstances, their individual needs, or their individual interests. And they're really interested in how these systems could be designed better to be fair or to take account of children's individuals' needs and interests. And that really ties into the next theme here on the slide, which is fairness and bias. This was a big area of concern and a big area of interest for all the children in the schools. Fairness emerged as a really key theme throughout all of this work, and this was something that we perhaps would have wanted to explore, but we hadn't planned for it to become such a major theme as it was. But we found that the children really quite intuitively gravitated towards discussions of fairness. In our initial workshop where we introduced AI, we used an example of an AI. We got the children to develop an AI system to recognize images of cats. This was a really fun game that we used to introduce concepts of how AI systems are designed and developed. The idea here was that the children had to design an AI system that would identify images of cats to recognize if an animal was a cat, to enable it to enter through a cat flap into a house. And first of all, the children had to begin by writing down descriptions of what a cat was. Like what would an AI system need to know to recognize a cat? What were the rules of what a cat, how to identify a cat? And they wrote down quite long lists of lots of characteristics of cats, and it often included things like, well, 2 ears, 2 eyes, 4 legs, a tail. We then had a physical like a hoop that was our cat flap, so the children had to try and get their cats in the cat flap, and showed them images of cats and some things that were not cats to look at based on the rules that they had created as to whether or not these things would get in. And inevitably there were some 3-legged cats that did not make it in the cat flap. There were some cats where you couldn't quite see the ears that didn't make it in the cat flap. But there were also some red pandas and some tigers that did get in the cat flap. And this led quite nicely into discussions of, well, was that fair? Was it accurate? Was it effective? But also, was it fair? And what would that mean for a 3-legged cat that wasn't identified as a cat? And this was something that was returned to again and again for all of our discussions when we were talking about AI in healthcare, we're talking about AI in education. Children would often return to the point of, well, what would happen if it didn't recognize, like our 3-legged cat, it didn't recognize? And they were really interested in exploring how these systems could be developed better to be fairer, to be able to anticipate all the different kinds of children who might be impacted by these systems. And this was something that they're really keen to take forward in discussions with developers, with policymakers, to explore further what it would mean to build these systems in ways that were fair. The next major theme that children were really interested in was safety and security. This related partly to being safe online and understanding what the risks are with engaging with content online. They're particularly interested in uses of AI or algorithms in in shaping and filtering online content, for example, through YouTube or social media, and understanding how decisions about them were being made, but also what data was being collected and what it might be being used for. They were interested in issues around privacy, but also around safety online, for example, through an awareness that there are often systems that were designed to be addictive or were designed to make it very easy for them to accidentally spend their parents' money, and wanting to understand how those systems could be built better so that children could feel safe online and to use systems with confidence. Finally, a big theme that we explored and that children are really interested in was around the future of AI. And as I said at the beginning, when we think about ethics, it's partly about addressing risks, but it's also really importantly about thinking about the ways of maximizing the value and benefits of technology and innovation. And this is something that the children were really excited about. They were very much aware that very much concerned about the risks and recognizing that these systems need to be designed responsibly and need to take account of children's rights and children's interests. But they also see huge potential for the ways that these systems can be developed to have real benefits in their lives, and real opportunities to benefit from innovation and technology. Now, I'm hoping I have a short video because I say a lot about what the children's views were, but I'd really like to be able to share the children's views in their own voices, because I think it is really quite special to hear that. So I'm hoping this is going to play. Fingers crossed. And I'm hoping it's going to play from the right point as well. Okay, here we go. Hopefully you can hear. Right. And then, can you hear? Yeah. We do get that is used for controlling things and seasoning people. But it's tougher for learning because a lot of the time from like Google stuff, it's just it comes down to say. If I was teaching most of the people in school using like all of them, and they would naturally get much opportunity for me. You're an actual person saying it, it would be just like a robot saying all their subjects all the time. And it would probably be a bit frustrating because the robots know everything and the teachers learn new things through the children. I've started to worry that AI might take over jobs that normal humans would usually do, and it would they would lose their job, and they would be a pickle for them to try and get a new one. I think it should not be used for like the police, military, any fighting kind of thing. More learning about how it treats people in the future and how it improve our future. Yeah. Okay, so we have Mhairi and privacy support. Yeah, privacy. So comic strips, what we do is we're gonna write. It's gonna be like a comic about about what might happen in the future. It's like we're just making it up, thinking about what might happen in the future. No matter what happens in the future, I guess we'll find out. Yeah. Making sure that children are safe online, like telling them, oh, don't go onto this website, you can get a virus on it, or don't do this, you can get hurt. And go in the ocean and pick up trash, and like as our family were doing our homeworks, it knows not to pick up any fish or get them in, but there's like massive things that are helping the planet so much, like taking all the trash out of the ocean. Because people have to spread the word about AI.
because everyone has the right to fairness and the same. It has not it has like has the right to on how they can use it. And children will make up ideas. When they're older, then they'd be able to like work to let other children know about AI.
Can get back to my slides. Oh dear, sorry. This is I've just stopped sharing to come back to my slides. I watched that video so many times, and every time I love it. I think these oh sorry, now I'm going to have to I should not have ambitiously put a video in my slides. Maybe
it's all good. It always happens.
There we go. Okay. Yeah, so this is a really wonderful project, and we're continuing to work on this project with Scottish Alliance and Children's Parliament over the next year. But what we find so far certainly is that the children have really quickly grasped key concepts. I think there's often a perception that AI or wider kind of data-intensive innovation is something really complex, something really technical that is difficult for everyday people to engage with. And I firmly believe that's not true. But certainly in this project, what we've seen very clearly is that the children could very quickly understand key concepts around the design, development, deployment of AI systems, and also really quickly get to grips with big ethical questions and governance questions around AI systems. And they were incredibly enthusiastic and excited to engage in this area, and really keen to influence decision-making and conversations around this area. They, as I've said, they had a really consistent focus on fairness, and this was the really key theme, really key area of interest that the children consistently came back to and wanted to explore. But they're really actively thinking about the role that AI plays in their lives and in their communities, thinking positively about creative ways that we might use this. And you saw that in the video. They came up with some amazing ideas of what AI could actually do that would be really beneficial in children's lives, but also thinking about the limits that should be set on that and what the kind of potential risks or dangers around AI might be. So in this next stage, which has been led by Scottish AI Alliance, the children are now engaging with decision makers, with policymakers, and seeking to inform decision making or inform kind of thinking around design, development, deployment of AI systems that impact their lives. And it's amazing to be a part of this process, to be part of the children's engagement with this, but also seeing that when decision makers, when policymakers hear from these children, they find it incredibly insightful. We've had some really concrete, tangible examples of people who have spoken to the children going away and say, okay, we need to think about this. We need to do things differently. We need to explore more about how we would take children's views on board in shaping future practices. And I think that's really positive and really exciting for what might come out of this work in the next stage. So finally, just to kind of sum up, as I said, I meant a social license, that the exploring what it would mean to establish a social license for AI and data-intensive practices is a really, I find a really fascinating, a really interesting area to think about ethics in practice and what it might mean to demonstrate ethical and responsible practices in this area. A social license is essentially a reflection of ethical and responsible practices, or a reflection of a wider social acceptability of those practices. Establishing a social license for AI and data-intensive practices may be absolutely crucial to ensure their social acceptability and sustainability. I referred to experiences in extractive industries where the concept of social license really emerged, and looking at experiences in extractive industries, there are many examples of where these approaches have been criticised for being tokenistic or being cosmetic or not really meaningfully engaging with communities' concerns. But what's really important when we think about how we might pursue a social license for data-intensive practices or for AI is that this has to go deeper, it has to go further. It has to be about meaningfully demonstrating that you're aligned with public interests, addressing public concerns, and ensuring the wider social acceptability of those practices. There have been many previous examples of data initiatives, such as Care.Data, going back a few years now, where there's been significant opposition as a result of a lack of public engagement or a lack of meaningful engagement with public concerns around proposed data initiatives. And so it shouldn't all be about ensuring acceptance or support. It should actually be about doing things better. But there's an important message to be learned there about the importance. If we don't attend to establishing a social license, there is real risk that these projects will not be sustainable, will not be socially acceptable, and will not be supported in the long term. But importantly, engaging with impacted communities is absolutely crucial in this process. This is establishing a social license is about maintaining relationships or trust to underpin that. It's not something that can be done as a one-off activity. It's not about finding out what people think once, ticking the box and then moving on. It's about building and maintaining those relationships over time, attending to those relationships to establish trust and maintain that trust on an ongoing basis. The example that I've shared today for work engaging with children is one example of the kinds of approaches that could be used to establish and maintain a social license. These are child-centered approaches which seek to really put children's voices, children's experiences, and children's rights at the center of design, development, deployment of AI systems. But this is one example. Obviously, children, as I said, are the group which may be most impacted by AI. But there are many, many other groups, and there are many, many other groups who are underrepresented in decision-making processes around AI systems or data-intensive systems. And we really need to be developing creative approaches to involving diverse communities, impacted communities in these discussions and bringing their voices in. I think one thing that is particularly exciting about the work with children is it shows that it shows the possibilities of having these conversations and having really meaningful conversations. I think there's a lot of perceived barriers to engagement with impact communities, including the perception that these topics are complex or technical. But what we find very clearly through the work with children is that is not true. These barriers are not insurmountable. Sometimes we need to take creative approaches, do things differently, find different ways into those conversations. But those conversations are really important, and everybody can be a part of them. Thank you. I really welcome any questions or comments or hear people's reflections on any of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mhairi. That was really, really interesting. I have a question to start us off, and then please either raise your hand or throw your questions into the chat. I see we have a comment from Terry already, but I wanted to ask you what was the most surprising thing you heard during the engagement with children, because I love working with kids for that reason. But if you could share that would be really great.
Yeah, I wonder most surprising. I think they have all kinds of things and lots of really interesting questions. Such curiosity about how things work, why things are designed the way they are. Maybe right at the beginning, and I should say that this work started, our engagement with children started September, October time last year, just before ChatGPT was released. And so when our first kind of conversations with children, we were talking about what do they know about AI? I imagine might be a bit different now because things have changed. There's been so much that has been in kind of public attention around AI over the last year. We found that generally the children had heard of the term AI, had also heard of the term artificial intelligence, often didn't realize that those were the same thing. But they'd heard of those terms, but I think what was challenging at the beginning was then differentiating what is AI and what is just something that's happening on a computer. And especially because we began to we tried to give lots of examples of AI that were maybe not the most obvious. So we weren't talking about robots, we weren't talking about physical machines, we're talking about systems. And that then made it challenging to then begin to think about what is and what isn't AI. And that there were some interesting kind of examples or questions around that. That's not necessarily it was the most surprising. I think there were lots of little things that came up along the way. I've got some questions around what this might be.
Terry's comment is around the challenge of how to transpose that kind of social awareness to have momentum and teeth to influence those who are driving AI forward with a little public voice.
Yeah, and that's absolutely crucial. That's a big part of what this work is trying to do. They're trying to not just find out what children think, but really develop mechanisms to then lead that for that to have influence and to have impact. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges around public engagement and public participation. Like there's lots of great work that happens, and there's lots of really established methods and approaches to engaging communities, involving people in these processes. But often the big problem or the limitation is that doesn't necessarily lead into decision-making processes. And certainly what I found in previous work that I've done is that there's often there might be like a rhetorical commitment to public involvement and public participation. And this is, rhetorically, said this is really important, we really value this, but that doesn't lead to meaningful commitments to act on the findings or the outputs or the recommendations of those processes. And what is often the biggest challenge in participatory processes is influencing the decision makers to increase the understanding of the value of the outputs of those participatory processes. What I found often is that, so a lot of my previous work has been around deliberative engagement and participation, running citizens' juries, public panels, deliberative events. And what can be really helpful is having the decision makers, the institutional actors who we want to influence, having them in the room to witness those processes. Because often what happens is there might be an investment in facilitating that process, and then the process leads to an outcome or a recommendation that's inconvenient, and it's written off as, well, maybe they didn't really understand it, or maybe you didn't tell them this, or maybe if they'd had access to this information, it would have been different. And actually, if those decision makers are in the room and see the depth of discussion and have insight into the nuance and the sophistication of the discussion, and experience that process, they come away with a different appreciation of, actually, no, that's meaningful. Those voices need to be listened to, and we need to do something. So yeah, I think a big part of the challenge is kind of culture change around recognizing the real value of participation, and having mechanisms to ensure that actually leads to impact and influence.
Selena's asked a very meaty question, which is, who should be responsible for establishing a social license? And then would a social license try to hold industries accountable in any way? Yeah,
I think that's a really interesting one. And it's something that I don't know, something that I'm trying to grapple with at the moment in research, thinking about, what are the responsibilities here? As I said, in extractive industries, these were normally approaches that were led by individual companies around their operations, but that led to some fairly tokenistic or limited approaches. And I think we might, if we were to suggest that is this the responsibility of individual developers or companies to pursue a social license for operations, we might also quite rightly have some skepticism about the motivations or the vested interests, particularly of private companies or developers, to do that, and the extent to which they could really, or they would really, have open and meaningful engagement with potentially impacted communities, and really, I suppose importantly, have openness to the extent that if that engagement suggested that something was unacceptable or was not aligning with societal interests, that they would abandon projects or radically overhaul projects. And I think we might have some skepticism around that in terms of private sector actors in those engaging processes. Not to say it's impossible, but this is about trust, and we need to establish that trustworthiness. I think it's slightly different when you look at public sector projects and practices, where these data-intensive systems or AI systems are ostensibly about creating public good and public benefit. That's a different set of motivations and rationales, and that's where I think there's a clear imperative to engage with communities and to establish a social license for publicly funded, publicly driven initiatives, and also where the relationships of trust might look slightly different, and maybe there's more opportunities to do that. I think, though, there's also there's the social license for particular initiatives and projects, but there's also potentially thinking about a social license for AI practices on a larger scale. So in terms of informing policy, informing governance, informing regulation, and there's certainly work that can be done in maybe across government, maybe across local government, in looking at what would be the conditions for social license for AI in particular sectors. So what does it mean to have a social license for uses of AI in education or in housing or in healthcare? And those are processes that could be led more by local government, by public sector, that could inform the practices of industry and organizations, but at a different level. And the issue about accountability, I think that's a tricky dimension of a social license, because this isn't something written. It isn't a written agreed, like there aren't clear conditions and terms. It's about relationships and trust. And so I guess the way that accountability feeds into that is that if those relationships aren't maintained and trust isn't established, or trust is eroded through practices, then accountability comes about through the removal of a social license, which potentially leads to a loss of social acceptability or increasing concern or opposition to practices of that organization.
Thanks so much. And Terry's commented that the world needs a Greta Thunberg in the AI world. I agree completely. Hopefully some of those children are inspired to do that. That'd be great.
Some of those children would definitely be up for taking that on, but definitely.
I was going to ask a more practical question about the activities you did with the children. In terms of talking about AI literacy and developing those ideas, were there some activities that worked better than others? Like, what learnings did you have around the practical materials that you used?
So we had the big advantage of working with Children's Parliament. Children's Parliament is a charity based in Scotland who work with primary school children on a range of different topics. So they've done a lot of work previously around climate change. They've done work around provision of milk in schools, around school uniforms, lots of topics that are relevant to children's lives. And they really are experts in engaging children in terms of developing creative methods and approaches. And so we were working with them and benefited massively from that collaboration, and also learned a lot through that collaboration. What worked best was definitely approaches that had the children moving and talking and physically doing things. We certainly found, I think, in the first workshops, myself and my colleagues from the Alan Turing Institute were there to give presentations to talk about, AI, introduce those concepts, and we learned very quickly that if we were talking for more than a couple of minutes, we'd lost them. It had to be very much child-led. The children, it's about posing questions that the children find ways to answer themselves and figure it out for themselves, and learning through activities and through doing things and creating things. So a lot of the activities that we do, the children will be drawing things or making models, or like physically doing something which then they can look at and say, like, this represents, and it's part of a discussion, and that was really important. So the example that I told about the cat flap as well, that was a really good one, because the children were physically moving, and there was a physical a hoop that was physically like a cat flap, and things like that. Like, I think with that age group, it's really important to have physical interaction and creativity and ways of expressing themselves.
Well, that sounds really interesting. If there's no other questions in the chat, I might ask one final question and then we'll wrap for the session. One thing that I have struggled with a little bit in not necessarily designing activities, but thinking about AI and engagement, is that when we practically talk about AI, obviously it is often just a fancy algorithm, or it's more the traditional term of algorithmic decision making. Then you get into generative AI, but a lot of the more interesting conversations are about the impact of AI in its, science fiction terms, and how did you balance that in the sessions of those sort of widely ranging, both practical versus ideological ideas of what AI is?
Yeah, and I think maybe that's where the age group was an advantage. They are 7 to 11-year-olds, so they haven't seen Terminator, or they certainly shouldn't have seen Terminator. So I think maybe kind of the sci-fi representations of AI were less present than might have been in an older age group, or indeed when engaging with adults. I think with adults, there is yeah, there are many misconceptions about AI, because AI is quite a familiar concept in movies and in stories, but represented in very unrealistic ways, and mostly represented as a kind of personified form, or something that is super intelligent. The kinds of narratives that have come out more in the mainstream over the last year around the risks of existential threats of AI, which I would firmly refute, but that's very much echoing the narratives of sci-fi, which have been persistent for a long time. And certainly when we engage with adults, there is a lot of misconceptions that come through that, because it's a very pervasive and familiar narrative about how AI is presented. But with this age group of children, that wasn't really the case. They didn't have those preconceptions about AI. They had the term was familiar to them. They'd heard it, but they tended to think of AI as being Alexa or Siri, or they knew that it had something to do with online content. These children are also at an age where they shouldn't really be on social media. They're too young to legally be on social media, but we know that many of them were. We know that they regularly used social media. And they definitely use YouTube, and they knew that AI had something to do with these systems and was something in the background. So they had that kind of level of understanding of AI, which in many senses might be more accurate than what we often hear in discussing AI with adults and public discussions of AI in adults, where there are these quite significant misconceptions of what AI is.
That's great. And just a massive thank you again. Your project sounds amazing, and I'd love for you to come back and give us an update on the next phase. But a couple more comments coming in, but just, a massive thank you for your time, and thank you everyone. We're going to close the session there.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me.